World leaders arrive in New York for the 78th session of the UN General Assembly.
5 Americans wrongfully detained in Iran are expected to be freed this morning as part of a prisoner swap worked out by the Biden administration.
Poland has suggested that it will no longer provide weapons to Ukraine.
Well, the United Auto Workers Union is sending a warning to the big three Detroit automakers this morning.
It's been another busy week of news, so it seemed like a good time once again to try to take stock of some of the most important things happening around the world. Leaders are meeting at the United Nations in New York City.
The atmosphere in New York and the global sense that this climate crisis is becoming very, very real will really give them a tailwind.
Iran and the U.S. exchange prisoners while Joe Biden looks to broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
It's very unclear exactly how that's going to play out and how tenable it might be in the long term, because these are, after all, countries that do act in their own interests in the longer term. And if there's a change of administration in the U.S., that could throw yet another wrench into the mix.
And here in Washington, Republicans are threatening to shut down the government.
Right now, you've got the likes of like Matt Gaetz, you've got some others in the Freedom Caucus. They want to use this as a way to extract their demands. Border walls, tighter immigration.
I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson, Ben Sills, and Mario Parker tell us what we need to know. Roz, once again, leaders are gathering in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, and yet a lot of the leaders of the world's biggest nations aren't showing up, and it kind of gives you the feeling that maybe the world's leaders are just all kind of sick of each other at the moment.
There might actually be a bit of truth to that, Wes. I mean, it's interesting. Every time the UN General Assembly rolls around, there seem to be these existential questions about the role of the meeting and its value. And given that the soup of all the other summits and gatherings that we have, how much it actually matters anymore. And certainly as sort of a lot of big leaders are not turning up this year, the leaders of China, the UK, France, obviously the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, is a no-show. And as countries like China really look to sort of other settings, other power blocks really to advance their influence, and some of these Western entities perhaps fall by the wayside. But it is one of those annual debates, really. What is the value and the role of the UNGA? Certainly you still are getting a lot of interesting leaders in town. You're getting discussion around a bunch of big topics, including, of course, developing economies, debt relief, how to support those economies globally. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is in town, again, agitating for more weapons. And of course, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is there as well. So there are some power brokers in town. It's really the meetings that they probably have on the sidelines with each other, away from the broad setting of the assembly, that are the ones to watch for the news that might matter.
And Mario, you're in New York covering this meeting. What are you seeing there?
Besides the traffic jams we're seeing across the city, we're seeing President Biden, again, on the world stage, kind of blur the lines between the diplomacy and the U.S. assuming its leadership role in the world, but also him making that as a case for why Americans should reelect him. The fact that he's drawing lines kind of similar to Roz's point about Zelensky being here. He's drawing a direct line between holding the line and willing support for Ukraine with democracy here at home in the U.S. as well.
Ben, at the G7, at the G20 meetings, every time leaders get together, Ukraine seems to be at the top or near the top of the agenda. What is the discussion around Ukraine right now?
Well, you know, Wes, you said that some of the leaders who haven't turned up are getting pretty sick of each other, but I think some of the leaders who have are also getting a bit sick of each other. And amongst those, I think Zelensky is probably top of the list. He got pretty fractious at the NATO summit in Vilnius back in July. He was agitating for more weapons and he felt his allies weren't moving quickly enough. He came into the UN on the back of a brewing row with the Polish president over grain exports.
Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary say they're banning the import and transit of grain from Ukraine to protect their own agricultural sectors.
Now, Poland has been one of the most vehement allies of Ukraine and of Zelensky since the start of the war. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, has been a close personal support, an ally, an advocate for Zelensky. And this row has just blown up in a really kind of shocking and probably quite worrying fashion if you're a Ukrainian. Duda was really quite explicit in an interview we did with him at how frustrated he is with Zelensky over grain exports. Duda's party, Law and Justice, of course, faces an election themselves middle of next month, and they are starting to just privilege some of their domestic political priorities ahead of aid for the Ukrainians, and Zelensky's not used to that. He doesn't like it.
It seems that we're entering a really potentially dangerous point in the conflict, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine as it drags on. We've seen US officials warning now publicly, this could go on for years. We have to be in here for the long haul. But also that it may change some of the calculations for Ukraine. And we're seeing that slight sense of fatigue coming in. At some points, even a bit of exasperation with the Ukrainian president. We saw that at the NATO meeting. And that feeling that perhaps the war is just grinding at this point, and we're heading towards a very, very tricky winter on the ground. And that perhaps is going to start more of those conversations around, where do we go from here? Does there have to be a proper conversation around a point of negotiation with Russia? Is this conflict just going to be a matter of time? Russia has time on its side, even though it's not making great inroads on the ground, and it's certainly struggling itself when it comes to weapons and manpower. But does it just sort of get some sort of benefit from the reality of time? And so we are seeing that question of exasperation, not just the grain aspect that Ben was talking about with Eastern Europe, but over the amount of aid, financial aid, weapons that have been going in, Republicans questioning that in the US. And that seems to be building towards something. Exactly what it is not quite clear, but it does feel as though the conversation around Ukraine is starting to shift.
Maria, beyond Ukraine, there are so many other issues on the table. Can you give us a broad overview of some of the other big issues that these leaders are discussing?
One of the central topics that emerged in President Biden's speech on Tuesday to the gathering was the climate disasters that we've seen pop up all over the world, particularly in the U.S., but other places as well, floods, earthquakes, etc. He's also trying to wrangle support in tandem with continued aid to Ukraine, but just trying to give more attention to climate change as well. So that's been one of the more prominent features here also.
I mean, some of the other interesting things that we've been watching, again, are really those bilateral meetings that have happened on the sidelines of the UNGA. We've seen the leaders of Turkey and Israel meeting with Elon Musk to try and get him to build Tesla factories in their countries and obviously entice him into doing business with them. And so that's been really interesting to see. And of course, some of the behavior of the Middle Eastern leaders has been very interesting at the same time as this has been happening. Away from the actual assembly itself, we're seeing some really interesting shifts in behavior by these leaders. We're seeing the role of Qatar, for example, recently in the swap of Iranian and US prisoners. We're seeing a much more assertive Middle East leadership on the stage in general, including in New York. They used to be very cagey and quiet about some of their actions behind the scenes, where they were playing roles of mediators or influencers. And what we're really seeing is a much more assertive actions by these countries, be it Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and others, and of course the leaders of Turkey and Israel. So really a bit of jostling going on amongst those countries to show that influence on the global stage. And that's certainly something also we've been watching very closely in New York.
Ben, with so many things happening, it's kind of hard to say whether there'll be one big takeaway from this meeting, but what do you expect to come of it this year?
I think the climate stuff probably is going to be one of the big takeaways, not least because, as Mario said, the build up to the meeting was dominated by so many kind of graphic images.
Libya, the disaster unfolding there after a major storm unleashed devastating floods. Thousands are feared dead tonight.
Wildfires are burning in different parts of the continent, including in France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Croatia and Greece.
Historic and horrific weather that's just slamming the Northeast.
16 cities in Italy are under red alerts for extreme heat.
We spoke to The European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, who's underlining her commitment to the European Green Deal and was quite active on the sidelines in really trying to burnish Europe's credentials and maintain that leadership position. So I think that while there are lots of questions in terms of popular support, pushback from voters, climate skeptics, quite active on the ground in European politics, the atmosphere in New York and the global sense that this climate crisis is becoming very, very real will really give them a tailwind.
After the break, can the U.S. help seal an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Roz, you said earlier that leaders from Middle Eastern nations had been asserting themselves more forcefully than they had before in New York. And another country is Iran in the news. We're starting to see this question of a deal between the Saudis and the Israelis, which always pulls in Iran. The U.S. is involved. Tell us exactly what's happening with that.
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, we had this prisoner swap recently. So it was a 5-for-5 deal. America got 5 Americans back. Iran got 5 Iranians back.
5 American citizens tonight are on the final leg of their years-long journey to freedom. Just hours from now, the prisoners who were wrongly detained inside Iran will arrive back in the U.S.
But in a way, the thing that's very interesting in all of this is Iran also got $6 billion back that had been locked up for years in South Korea, tied up in the morass of sanctions and penalties over its nuclear program. And that $6 billion is a really big deal for Iran. And it seems that it came with sort of the promise that would only be used for certain things like humanitarian aid, but no way of enforcing that. So in the end, the US essentially allowed Iran to take that money back. And it's coming against a backdrop of this idea of gentle navigation of Iran to be a better actor on the nuclear front, but also that quietly, Iranian oil has been flowing again. And that's a really interesting thing for the US. And we're in an environment where the US is probably watching very closely to see if we're back in an era of oil over $100, which I'm sure Joe Biden does not want to see as we get into election season. It's a protracted period of high oil inflation back in the headlines and the questions of what that means for the Federal Reserve. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Russia have been unilaterally sort of using their clout in the global oil market to try and keep prices high by cutting output. So if you have Iranian oil flowing again, does that affect the dynamic? So there's really a bunch of very big, complex things that play beyond what you would see on the surface as a straightforward prisoner swap. And it all leads back in some fashion also to US politics and the US economy. Then you have the idea of sort of Saudi Arabia and Israel joining forces more and more overtly in the Middle East. And that's sort of a very new development in recent years that we're seeing. And that's leading to a greater trust around business ties, investment, trade ties, but also the US wanting Saudi Arabia and Israel very much working with it for American interests in the region. It's very unclear exactly how that's going to play out and how tenable it might be in the long term, because these are, after all, countries that do act in their own interests in the longer term. And if there's a change of administration in the US, that could throw yet another wrench into the mix.
And Mario, Joe Biden for a long time has tried to strike a deal with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations between the Saudis and the Israelis. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this week. Exactly what's happening in that discussion?
Well, a couple of things. There's drama, first of all, in the fact that Netanyahu had been expected to meet at the White House much earlier than this. Back in July, Israeli President Herzog visited the White House.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's wonderful to see you again. I bring a message of greeting and gratitude on behalf of the people of Israel, the entire nation of Israel.
Now, that's a mostly ceremonial role, while Netanyahu, essentially there had been speculation, or it was viewed widely, that it was a snub toward him. So the White House quickly, given the tight relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the U.S. quickly said that, oh, well, they'll meet at some time. They met on the sidelines Wednesday of the UN summit. So it's not quite a White House visit, right, that Netanyahu would typically expect. Biden had some terse words from him earlier this year, given some of the far-right initiatives that he's undertaken, particularly with their judiciary as well. But look, as you mentioned, Wes, Biden wants to normalize relations between the Arab states, Israel, Saudi Arabia being one of those as well. But also, to Roz's point, not all of this is just altruism on the part of the U.S. or Joe Biden. A lot of this, recall, is the fact that Saudi Arabia, a major oil producer, is being courted by China. For the U.S., for Biden, there's a strategic benefit to kind of reining that in and stepping in the way of that. And again, to Roz's point, particularly as we look at just how vital the role Saudi Arabia plays in the energy market, and we look toward 2024, and we know Americans love their gas-guzzling cars.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me, there was a report by JP Morgan out at the start of the week, which said that the 9 million barrels of oil that the Saudis are pumping every day is 2 million less than they were pumping a year ago. And that's lower than anything we've seen over the last decade, except that anomalous period during the COVID lockdowns. That, to me, is a sign of just how indifferent the Saudi administration seems to have become in the run-up to a US election, to be allowing or indeed encouraging the price of oil to rise so high. Shows just how that relationship has cooled in recent years.
When we come back, Washington heads toward another government shutdown. Mario, another big piece of news back in the U.S. is the United Auto Workers strike against all three of the big legacy Detroit automakers. Joe Biden, again, very closely watching that strike for a lot of reasons, the U.S. economy, his own election.
Last Friday, Biden made a statement when they decided to strike, saying that he was going to dispatch two of his top aides over the last 7 days. He did not dispatch those aides, instead saying that they were going to be on the sidelines. They'll swoop in whenever it was the best moment. They're going to let the two sides kind of hash it out without the heavy hand of the White House directly interfering, right? But then there's the thorny politics of it all, because right now, as it stands, there's a potential rematch for the 2024 presidential election. And Biden's number one rival, his predecessor, former President Donald Trump, has announced that he will be visiting Detroit next week to counter-program the debate, but also as a way to kind of drive a wedge between both union leadership and the rank and file, but also to spread that populist message and try to peel away again some of those labor interests that were loyal to President Biden in 2020.
But it's also a big question globally when we're talking about the intricacies of the global supply chain. We've got companies in Asia, Japanese companies that get parts from some of these big automakers in the US. So it's not just the actual vehicles themselves, but it's components, or they supply components to these automakers, and questions about whether that's going to continue, how long the strikes might go on for as a result. So it really is, again, a reminder that we're all very much bound together when it comes to global supply chains, and what can happen in one country can have a really big knock-on effect around the world, into Asia, into Europe and beyond. And so a lot of companies are watching that closely. They're watching, obviously, to see if their staff get ideas from what's happening in the US and decide that now's also the moment to go on strike. Of course, there's no sort of forensic data to hand, but the Ross-Matheson radar a little bit is sort of pointing to a bit of an uptick in industrial action in general, which is sort of a reflection of the global political climate.
Mario, you thought you could flee to New York and escape the battles in Washington, but another really big story happening in the U.S. is in D.C. over the potential of a government shutdown.
Internal fighting within the Republican Party is threatening a deal in the US Congress. As a result, the House remains at a standstill while the government shutdown draws nearer.
What exactly is happening? Because unlike usual ones where it's Republicans versus Democrats, this one seems to be Republicans versus Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if anyone was paying attention to the battle for the Speaker's gavel earlier this year, this is not a surprise. It may be dismaying, especially as we look at the economic effects and the likelihood that we're barreling toward a government shutdown. You can see all of this playing out in some of the opposition to Speaker Kevin McCarthy's pursuit of some level of bipartisanship in order to just get some of these more rudimentary things done. Passing a budget, keeping the government going, all those things. We saw some of this flare up earlier this year with the threat of the debt ceiling. Right now, he's got the far right part of his party, and he has to bridge that gap with the more moderates, right? The deal that House Speaker McCarthy made in order to get the gavel was the fact that it would only take essentially one person saying that he needs to vacate that position. Right now, you've got the likes of like Matt Gaetz. You got some others in the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus, for our listeners who aren't aware, are essentially the far right part of the Republican Party. They want to use this as a way to extract their demands. Border walls, tighter immigration. We mentioned earlier in the program about funding for Ukraine, all those things that are dear to them.
Ben, when the rest of the world is looking at what's happening in Washington, they've certainly seen this show before, but is there any concern about the government shutting down for some period of time? Does it have knock-on effects in the rest of the world?
I'm sure that if you are trying to trade this situation, you can't avoid thinking about what sort of hedges you want to put on. But I think the broader reaction in Europe is just a bit of eye-rolling. It seems to be every 6 or 9 months or so we have like a debt ceiling standoff or a government shutdown or some kind of partisan gridlock that threatens to obstruct the US government, but the US economy, the US state keeps rolling on. The US did lose its AAA rating recently, but I think the markets in general shrugged that off, and I don't think they're too worried about this either.
Ben, Mario, Raz, great to see you.
Nice to see you too, Wes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Federica Romagnello is our producer. Our associate producer is Zenab Siddiqui. Hilda Garcia is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back on Monday with another Big Take. Have a great weekend.